Welcome, folks, to Civil Rights Part 3 of 4 video lessons. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So we still have a few more, one more after this one, video lessons to cover. Today, we're going to talk about the first three items on this list: Native American rights, women's suffrage, and then the women's rights movement and feminism. And then the following, or the last video, we're going to talk about LGBTQIA rights and immigration. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about before we dig into the nitty gritty here. This country has two original sins. Okay, the first original sin being the genocide committed against Native Americans, and the second is, of course, slavery. We have still yet to make good on this. I mean, I don't know if you even can make good on this if it's possible, but certainly this country could do a lot more in trying to at least attempt to repair the damage that's been caused. This has been almost for our entire history that we have failed to, epically, just horrifically failed to even attempt to help deal with just some of the massive awfulness that came from United States policy toward Native Americans, toward the American Indian. So historically speaking, there are three different policies that I want to talk about here. One was set, this would not just policies, but stages. The first stage of government policies that were enacted was separation, okay? The goal of the United States government was to push the Indians out, keep them away from white America, from real America, right? And I use air quotes because I don't agree with the notion that Native Americans are not real Americans, and this notion that in order to preserve American ideals, we must remove people. I disagree with this idea. So the first goal was separation, right? That was the first stage of the policies. You know, this is with various treaties, the Trail of Tears, moving the Indians out further west, further south. That was the first stage. Once we had effectively conquered the rest of the country, and I do use the term conquered, not settled, not explored, conquered. This is a purposeful use of the term. Then the next stage, stage two, was assimilation and citizenship. So Native Americans were rounded up, put in schools that were government-sponsored schools. They're basically re-education centers where we forced the American Indian to remove any remnants of their original culture. They had to cut their hair. They had to wear, quote unquote, American clothes. They had to speak English. They had to adopt Christianity and give up their native religion and native beliefs. And in exchange for this, it's like, oh, you can kind of be an American. But I want you to make a note that over here, 1924, full citizenship was granted to Native Americans in 1924. They were the last group of folks in this country to gain full citizenship. In 1924, that's less than 100 years ago. This is unconscionable. And the final stage, which we're in now, is tribal restoration. The U.S. government has attempted to help deal with some of the after effects of American policies toward the Native American, where we have granted tribal lands, specific tribal lands where those folks can pretty much do whatever they want. They have their own laws, they have their own police force, they can have casinos, for example. But this is not even close to being a drop in the bucket of what the Native American has endured at the hand of the American government. Today, there is a resurgence of renewed cultural pride, as is stated there. But to be fair, Native Americans are the least educated, most unemployed, and poorest of all U.S. ethnic groups. Of all U.S. ethnic groups. So this is something that we need to keep a policy focus on. We need to engage the Native American community in a deeper and more substantive way to try to deal with the after effects of this nationwide genocide that has perpetuated since our founding. So, women's struggle for equal rights. I'm just going to move my camera guy over here. So, okay, I want to differentiate here. There are stages of women's struggle for equal rights. And it would be a mistake to confuse the early political movements for women's rights with the modern day idea of feminism. These things were not the same. They were not the same. I want you to understand this. They were not the same thing. So I want to put out a date and an event for you. 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. There's a famous document that came out of that, and it was called the Declaration of Rights of Women. Basically, it's the Declaration of Independence, but things are substituted. They took the structure of the Declaration and many of the words of the Declaration and substituted woman for man, and some of the wrongs that have been perpetuated against women were inputted in place of the wrongs that King George committed against us. It's a very famous document. American history, you'll definitely be taking a look at that. Now, those women were not equivalent to the modern day feminist movement, as in they did not agree with the same things. While there were some women in that movement that were devoutly about the equality of men and women, many of these folks were not. They believed that women should have political rights and should have a larger say in how the United States was governed because they represented the moral guiding light for the United States due to the emphasis on women's role in raising children and keeping the home, right? They sort of served as the moral compass for American society. But that should not be mistaken for the notion that a lot of folks at this point in the 1800s, for example, and even the early 1900s, believed that men and women were equal in every way, or that women should be allowed to enter the workforce or engage in work that was solely relegated to men. This was not the case. Most women in that era did not want that at all. They did not. They believed in this idea of separate spheres. This notion that women have their place and men have their place. The issue was that men were making all these rules, and since they didn't have a proper moral compass, and women did, the country was missing out on this knowledge. The next stage was women's suffrage specifically, and that we get with the 19th Amendment in 1920, and that grants women the right to vote. It's not until the 1960s, 1970s that you have what we would consider the more modern feminist movement emerge, where we are talking about total and full equality for men and women. The notion that a woman in and of herself is acceptable, that she doesn't need a man with her. This notion is a relatively new idea in throughout world history. So I want you guys to keep this in mind. There were stages of civil rights and equal rights for women, and they were not at these different historical stages. They were not all fighting for the same thing. That's important to note. I've included a couple of one image up here, and then this meme. I enjoy hearkening back to this because it represents actually a lot of the things that women have struggled for throughout the centuries. Women in the 1600s, I was just thinking, men, which, as if a thinking, independent woman who knows her own mind is dangerous to society. This is a danger, right? It threatens what we would call the patriarchy. Is this largely this idea? We don't engage in witch hunts in that way anymore, but we are still struggling with this as a society. The ability of women to govern their own bodies, for example, is still a major issue, which we'll talk about in other video lessons and a little bit here too. So just to give you a gauge, you can pause the video and just take a look at this. You don't need to write this down, but I just want you to have just comparing the U.S. to the world, just kind of an overview of where we rank, right? So the United States is right over here in 1920, and then you can see all the countries that did it before us and the countries that did it after us. So just to give you some context of where the rest of the world is in terms of women having the right to vote. All right, so the modern women's movement, I want to take just a minute to break this down. This is more of an American history thing, but I think in United States government, it's helpful to trace the historical progression of ideas, the central ideas and central goals of the various stages of the women's movement. So you have women's suffrage that's largely in the 1820s to 1920, right, when we get the right to vote. This was, like I said, almost uniformly about the right to vote and just having some basic civil protections. But, women aren't trying to go into the workforce. They're not trying to hold the same jobs. They're not trying to live on their own without men. That's not what's happening here for the most part. Most folks at this time did believe in fundamental differences between genders and believed in this, what I mentioned before, the separate sphere ideology. Now, feminism, as we would understand it, well, almost how we would understand it, It starts from the early 1900s to the 1960s. A lot of this is advocating total equality for women. Right to vote was an essential step in this process. These folks did not believe in fundamental differences or separate spheres, and they advocated for complete and total economic, political, and civil protections. Now we're into a little bit of a different phase of the women's rights movement. This takes feminism a step further, and now the goal is to eradicate all discrimination and all sexism. Now, that's I mean, who would want to keep? Well, I suppose there are some people who would want to keep sexism and discrimination. I am obviously not one of those people. But, when you think about it, it's like, no, you don't want to treat people unequally. Like, that's bad. In this modern world, you should, want to stop that. But we have some differences of opinions when it comes to policy over what is actual discrimination. Like, for example, the fact that women are largely still responsible for child rearing is a function of our the social fabric of the United States. Women don't have to have children any longer, but if they choose to, child rearing responsibilities are primarily going to fall into them. That's going to take them out of the workforce. When and if they go back, they're not going to be at the same place they were when they left. And the men who stay, or other women who stayed in the workforce and either didn't raise children or didn't leave the workforce to do that, are going to be, years ahead in terms of experience and advancement. So some would argue that, the pay gap is what I'm really talking about, for example, is not a function of discrimination. It's simply a function of life choices. Now, I'm not going to say I agree, disagree, one side or the other. All I'm saying is that the women's liberation movement in the present day would argue that any distinction, any differences between, for example, equal pay, promotions, is fundamentally a function of discrimination. And folks on the more conservative side might argue, this is not a function of discrimination. This is a function of life choices, and the government isn't empowered to deal with that. So that's a policy idea that we'll discuss in class. So we still do have some gender-based discrimination in the workplace, as I was talking about. But part of the goal to get rid of this started in 1964 in a particular area of the Civil Rights Act. That would be Title VII. This prohibits gender discrimination in employment. But again, you've got to prove intent. You've got to prove it. That can be tough to prove. The Supreme Court has also held that sexual harassment is prohibited based on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So now, but unfortunately, as we've seen over the past few years, sexual harassment is alive and well in the workplace, and many women, when they do speak up, they are punished, and the perpetrator of said harassment is not punished. In fact, in many cases, they're promoted or they're simply moved to another area of the company, and this is a problem. So you can pause the video and just take a look at this. You don't need to write all this down, but you should be aware of these things, just so you know. This is what Title IX, which is a key aspect of civil rights protection for women. This is what's in Title IX. We're having a debate about Title IX right now in how it applies to trans women and trans men because of the discussion of what gender is, what that spectrum is. Is it a spectrum? So there's a societal debate, more than a debate. It's a fight. We're fighting. We're having a culture war right now about this. So we are going to explore this issue in class as well, but I'd like you to just take a look. This is what Title IX guarantees, what it protects. Take a look at that. All right, so as I said, there's an issue of wage discrimination. Recent figures, we're looking 80 cents. Women earn 80 cents for every dollar made by a man. One thing I also should mention is that it depends on if you're doing an overall, like every woman and every man, or are you doing it based on profession? So women tend, if you look at the breakdown of where women find employment, tend to gravitate towards the caregiving professions, which tend to pay less. Now, are women gravitating towards that because they truly wish to, or are they gravitating towards that because there are too many barriers in place in other industries, such as engineering or science or professor level jobs? So depending on which stats you look at, that 80 cents goes up, goes down. We'll explore that a little bit more when we get into Unit 5 and we look at how statistics can be manipulated by various sides to favor a particular policy. We did get the Equal Pay Act of 1963, but we do still have the issue of this idea of the glass ceiling where women can only make it so far and then they're left looking to see where they could have gone, but they're stopped from getting there. And this notion of the pink collar ghetto, which we'll explore more in class. So we also have, and this I forgot to put it on the key idea slide, but there also is this issue of older Americans. There's a lot of age discrimination, and there was an act passed, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 1967, and that prohibits discrimination by age in all but a limited number of occupations where age is considered relevant to the job. You can Google that if you'd like to know what professions it doesn't apply to. There's a mandatory, this idea of mandatory retirement has progressively been made illegal because for a while there was mandatory retirement. They would just push you out whether you were ready to retire or not. So those rules have been eradicated over time. But there were particular laws in 1978, 1986 that explicitly made those illegal. So we also have to discuss the rights of persons with disabilities. Many folks with disabilities, whether they be something that's physically visible, like somebody who requires a wheelchair or crutches or something, or if it's something that's not as visible, say somebody with autism or ADHD. Now, the American with Disabilities Act of 1990 is one of those things that government did that was good. It did cost money. It did massively increase regulations, but it did a lot of good things like prohibiting job discrimination. This notion that, oh, well, you're blind, so you can't do this job. Well, being blind doesn't stop you from being able to think your way through problems. Being deaf doesn't inhibit your thinking or your ability to perform a variety of tasks. So this notion that, oh, just because you're this or that, you clearly cannot do this job, that's unfortunately something that still persists, but this act helped to disabuse people of that notion and also build in legal protections for folks to fight against that kind of discrimination. Also requires physical access to public buildings and public services, but there are some limitations. For example, if you are a private residence, you don't need to comply with every single part. If you're a business open to the public, there are other regulations that don't apply to private residences. Also, if, say, you're a landlord and you have a rental property, there are certain things you have to do to comply, but if you haven't done major renovations after this, well, okay, so you're grandfathered in, right? So this came in 1990. So if you haven't done fundamental renovations, like massive, extensive renovations to your building since before 1990, you don't have to comply with every single aspect of the law, but eventually you're going to have to make renovations, and once you do those major renovations, then your new construction must comply. So there are some limitations where not every single business, every single building had to instantly invest, billions of dollars in updating, but all public buildings had to. Government buildings, that is. Another one thing we need to talk about is the rights and status of juveniles. So there's a presumption that children are supposed to be protected by parents. Unfortunately, I'm a teacher, and I've sadly witnessed this absolute lack of protection by some parents of their children, and it's probably the saddest part of my job is seeing that play out. But there's this presumption goes way back. Child labor was widespread in the early 20th century in the 1900s, with children as young as 4 or 5 working in factories and getting maimed or killed. The Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938 to outlaw child labor, and we also started advocating for required full-time public education that students were required to attend. So this helped with that a little bit. Legal definition of minor does vary by state to state. Some states it's 18 and under, but in some states, certain crimes are considered so heinous that a child can be charged as an adult. For example, brutal murder. Some kids can be charged as young as 16 or even 14. Some national voting rights issues came into play with the Vietnam War in particular, because back then, or before 1971, you had to be 21 to vote, but you were 18 and you could be drafted, so you couldn't vote to participate in the process, but you could be forced to fight in a war that you didn't get to comment about. So in 1971, we adopted the 26th Amendment, and that granted suffrage to 18-year-olds. It lowered the voting age to 18. So that is the end of Civil Rights Part 3, folks. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you next time.